We're in the season of ordinary time, which on the church calendar makes up the big second half of the church year. And what does it mean to find ourselves in ordinary time? Well, in one sense, it means that we are not celebrating anything in particular. Those seasons which mark the life of the church in the life of Jesus, from Advent through Pentecost, have passed. And we have been shaped and formed and fed by the story of Jesus as we have heard it in the Scriptures and as we have celebrated it in our liturgies. Now, in ordinary time, we count the weeks of ordinary life until we arrive again in Advent. But ordinary time is not a time merely to be passed through. In the prayer that we just prayed, we asked that God would be intent in increasing and multiplying God's mercy on us, that we would look to God as our ruler and our guide so that we could pass through things temporal, not as something simply to be gotten through, but that we may not lose the sense of the eternal that presses upon and permeates the temporal. Remember, we celebrated in Eastertide a heaven and earth together kind of life, a Jesus kind of life. So what ordinary time is about following Jesus. And we have this hinge between the life of Jesus and the life of the church on Pentecost Sunday, and then we recognize the doctrine of the Trinity, which makes the life of discipleship possible, right? How is it that this Jesus is God, that his Spirit is God, and that we are brought into the life of God ourselves? We say that that's possible because of what we see God doing in the Scriptures, and we recognize that as the Trinity. Where do we go from here? What does the Spirit do on Pentecost, throwing us into the world? What does the doctrine of the Trinity tell us about our place here on earth? Where do we go from here? Well, we go into ordinary time. The color of ordinary time is green. It's always green. Because in the season of ordinary time, we look to grow, having heard the story of Jesus. We look for health. We've rushed, right? Advent is meant to slow us down. Lent is meant to slow us down. But if your life is anything like my life, this coincides with the academic year. This coincides with the big holidays where people travel and they gather with family, and we have rushed from one thing to the next. And it feels like even the leisure of summertime has been taken from us, right? No longer does Clark W. Griswold Jr. fill the wooden paneled station wagon to drag his family to Wally World. Or maybe he does, and Wally World just looks like Champion Fields or the water park or getting to that coveted vacation spot. But we look to give ourselves to growth and health. And we're reminded, there is no better object lesson than the garden that sits behind our church, where life sprouts up slowly from the ground. Unless they're weeds, that goes quickly. But the plants that we want, the ones that we cultivate, they grow slowly, and they flower, and they fruit, and they give us life. And this is what we're looking for in ordinary time. We are looking to receive life from the source of our life, who is Jesus. Where does our life come from? I was struck by the words of the psalmist this week in Psalm 81. the very end of what we read together. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. Earlier in the psalm, the psalmist says, "For it is a statute for Israel, a rule of the God of Jacob. He made it a decree in Joseph when he went out over the land of Egypt." Statute, rule, decree. These things are meant to give us life. Look what God did with that. He spoke to us in a language that God's people had not known. What is that language? It's not Hebrew. God says, "I relieved your shoulder of the burden. Your hands were freed from the basket. I gave you rest." That's the language that God's people did not know. So God brings them out of their captivity. He tells them to open their mouths wide so that he can fill it. The commandments, right? The rule, the statute, the decree, these are meant to give us life. And we heard from Deuteronomy this morning, the second giving of the law. That's what Deuteronomy means. It means second law. And what you see in the book of Deuteronomy is kind of a fast-paced repeating of the book of Exodus. A generation that has not heard. A generation that did not see Moses ascend Sinai, that did not fear as the cloud descended on the mount, that did not look away, asking Moses to veil his face when he came down to give them the law. A new generation has arisen, and they need to be instructed. And so Moses sits to teach the children of Israel before they enter into the promised land, the decrees and the statutes and the rules of God. And Moses gives them the 10 words, the 10 commandments. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us." It's a living fellowship. All who are here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain. Notice what Moses is doing here. This generation was not there. But the living fellowship that the living God has covenanted with has made this fellowship with you. He spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the midst of the fire while I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire and you did not go up into the mountain. He said, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." That's how the commands start. These are not disembodied commands. These are not rules that are given from on high. These are rules that are not given without context. God has delivered you to give you life. And life looks like this. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or in the earth beneath or in the water that is under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. That sounds terrifying, but listen how much more. But showing steadfast love to thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. As much as I think we should not use God's name as a curse word, this is about ascribing to God things that God does not do. Carmen Joy Imes, who teaches at Biola, has a beautiful book on this that's worth your time and energy to work through. Then God says to the children of Israel this, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner, the alien who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. That is a long commandment with a lot of context. Right in the middle of the other commandments. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long and that may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or husband, we should add. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. They needed to be trained, and the law was given to them. The Sabbath law is the longest law, and it's actually the most frequently repeated law in the Old Testament. God gives his people this statute, this rule, this guide. He gives it to them freely. They did not earn it. They did not deserve it. He gave it to them because he loves them, and he wants them to live. He saved them from Egypt because he loved them and he wanted them to live. The law is life-giving. We get this so wrong so many times, especially when we read through the Gospels and we see Jesus calling out the religious leaders and the Pharisees and calling them hypocrites, and we think to ourselves, oh, the law must have been so bad. But the law is good. Paul talks about this in Romans. He talks about this in the Galatians. The law is spiritual. I am fleshly. That's why I don't get it. The law is life-giving when it comes from the inside. When God is bringing his people out of exile in Babylon in the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, he says, I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to give you a heart of flesh. I'm going to replace that heart of stone. And no longer will one tell to another, obey the Lord, because it will be written on your heart. The law is life-giving when it lives within us. But the law is stifling when it comes from the outside. This is what Paul describes as the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. This doesn't necessarily mean that what the law says isn't important, but it is to say that what the law means and what the law is for gives what the law says all of its life. So is the problem with the law or with us? Now, I want to be careful here. I want to be actually exceedingly careful here, because this is the point at which culture warriors will talk about how the culture is bad and we hate the culture and the culture is ruining things, and if we could just get back to doing things God's way, well, by golly, it would be a lot better, wouldn't it? When I ask the question, is the problem with the law or with us? The question I really am trying to press is not, and I don't even have to name names, right? You know what speech I'm talking about recently, right? Okay. This is not that. The question I'm asking is, have I understood the spirit of the law, or have I given myself completely over to the letter of the law? Have I understood what this is for? Right? This is not reactionary. The question about is the problem with the law or is the problem with me is not reactionary. It's a question meant to slow us down, sit us down, and have us examine our lives and ask the question truthfully. Am I living by the letter of the law? The outward form? That which does not inhabit my heart? Or am I living by the spirit of the law? Am I letting the law enter into the deepest places of me? Am I allowing it to transform me? Am I allowing it to change me? Is it even capable of doing that? If it wasn't, I don't know that God would have given it to his people. But in and of itself, the law is unfulfilled. The problem with the law is not that it's bad. The problem with the law is that it's unfulfilled. In Matthew, Jesus says to those that he has sat down to teach, don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. In fact, not the smallest stroke of a pen in the letter that's written down of the law and the prophets will I do away with. I am fulfilling the law and the prophets. And so what we need is the fulfiller of the law, not, and I want to be careful here too, because I don't want to just be like, well, Jesus fixed it. Now we're good. Jesus fulfilled it so that we can actually live it. So that the law no longer stays a letter that stifles or oppresses me, but becomes the spirit by which I live. It's now written on my heart. I don't have to go around and say, obey the Lord, obey the Lord, obey the Lord, obey the Lord. Because you know. The Spirit testifies with your spirit that you are a child of God. Jesus teaches us one Sabbath. Interesting connection between that very long commandment that was given in the law of Moses. Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as he and his disciples made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did? When he was in need and hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the showbread, the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. What is this law for? Why is it repeated so many times in the Old Testament? Why is it given in such a long way in the middle of the tablets of the commandments? Is it to keep me from working? Yeah, it is. But why? Is it so that boredom is a virtue. I was going to say it's not to make you bored, but actually it might be to make you bored because I think boredom is a virtue. It's a virtue that we have lost touch with. It's where creativity comes from. You got to get bored sometimes. But I don't think that God just wants you to be bored. When I was young, let me use I statements. When I was young and I read the Bible, naively and ignorantly mostly, I would come across things like the Sabbath commandment and I would be like, I'm so glad we don't have to live like that anymore. I'm so glad I can do whatever I want. I'm so glad I can go wherever I want. I'm so glad and I don't want anybody telling me what I can and can't do on what day. Why is one day more special than any other day? Why should I have all of these restrictions on my life? But now that I'm a parent and a full-time employee, I like a day where someone is saying to me, you don't have to do anything today. You're not allowed to. You can't go anywhere. That's heaven. They call them, is Gen Z, some of you guys are Gen Z back there, not all of you. Rotting days, right? Is that what these are called? Where you just don't get out of your pajamas and you stay in bed? What is it? Bed rotting. Let me bed rot. Woo! I mean, there's nothing wrong with a little productivity, but my goodness. But what Jesus says at the end of this teaching, the end of this confrontation, he's not sending the Pharisees away like they're bad people, like they're his enemies. And even if they were his enemies, do you know what Jesus said about how to treat your enemies? Love them. Jesus is trying to reorient them. They've taken the law and they've gone around and they've said, obey the Lord, obey the Lord, obey the Lord, obey the Lord. It stifles people. It becomes a burden that's too heavy for them to bear on their own. And Jesus says, you've got to see this gift for what it is. I need to eat. We need to eat. We're in a time of trouble. He compares himself to David, who was fleeing from Saul, scared for his life. And he and his men needed food. And the only food available to them was the bread of the presence, this bread that sat in the inner court of the temple, the holy place, not the holy of holies, but the holy place, and represented the tribes of Israel in the presence of God. They took it and they ate it so that they could live. The Sabbath was given to you not to kill you, but for you to live. I am the Lord your God who delivered you out of the land of slavery, up out of the house of Egypt. I got those backwards. Out of the land of Egypt, up out of the house of slavery. I took you out of there so that you could be alive. If you're going to use the Sabbath to kill people, you're using the Sabbath wrong. Jesus says to the Pharisees in another place, actually in the next passage where he heals a man with a withered hand in a synagogue on the Sabbath. He says, don't you have like exceptions where you can rescue a donkey or an ox out of a well if it falls in on the Sabbath? Can't you save it? Can't you give it life? Why can't we give this man life on the Sabbath? He says to them, you are not for this. You don't exist to keep a bunch of rules. These limitations exist for you, that you can live, that you can have some space to think and delight, to savor the taste of the food that you prepared ahead of time, to enjoy the light of the candle that illuminates the face of the people that you love across the table. That you can go to bed at a decent time. This is for you. Robert Jensen is not as well known as I wish he was. He's with the Lord now, but he was probably the most influential American theologian of the 20th century. I don't think there was anybody as brilliant or as thoughtful or as open to being wrong as Robert Jensen was. A Lutheran theologian. And I was reading through one of his books on the Trinity, of all things. And he got a little bit into the discussion of the law and the gospel. And then I was listening to a podcast with a woman who teaches up at Northern Seminary, a woman whose name I've been dropping a lot lately, Beth Felker Jones, another brilliant theologian, a Methodist theologian. And listening to the podcast with her, she said something that Jensen said in his book, and I'd never heard this idea before, and it has sit so deeply with me. And then, of course, it's in the texts that we're in this morning. And it's this question, this insight. What if what we hear as commands, what if what we hear as the law from God, what if they're transformed into promises in Jesus? Let me just try this. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. What if instead of hearing, you shall have no other gods before me, as a command, you were capable of hearing, you won't have any other gods other than me, as a promise? Think of all of the idolatries that we contend with. What if instead of, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or a likeness or anything that is in heaven or earth, what if instead of hearing that as, make sure that you resist, make sure you don't bow down, what if you heard it as the promise that you will be free enough that you won't have to? You won't even be tempted to. What if you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain? You hear it as, you will be free to not ascribe anything to the Lord that is not the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebekah and Leah and Rachel. You'll be free not to ascribe anything to that God that God is not doing. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What if you will find rest for your soul? Is the promise that you hear. Honor your father and mother. What if you heard it as a promise that you will have fathers and mothers who are worth honoring? You shall not murder. What if you heard it as a promise that you will be free not to kill? You shall not commit adultery. You won't want to commit adultery. You shall not steal. You'll have everything that you need. You won't bear false witness against your neighbor. You will love your neighbor as yourself. You won't have to lie about them. You shall not want the things that belong to your neighbor. Your heart will be free. Changes things, doesn't it? Paul talks in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 about how the law, when it's read to this generation, is veiled. The God of this world, the God of the air. He's talking about those principalities and powers and authorities that are spiritual realities that are contending against our souls all the time, that are seeking to make us unfree. They veil so that we cannot understand the law when it's read to us. We hear it as a command when it's meant to be a promise. Paul says, the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That in Jesus, seeing him for who he is, that he is the glory of God, that he is our Redeemer, our Savior, our source of life, our teacher, that he transforms these commands into promises. That we have been confused about what the law is for, and in Jesus the law becomes life for us. It stops being something that stifles us from the outside, and it becomes that which guides us from the inside. It's no longer outside of us, afflicting us, crushing us, perplexing us, driving us to despair, persecuting us, striking us down, destroying us. Instead, inside of us, we have this treasure that allows this fragile jar that is the law. When we find the life of Jesus inside of it, giving life, reorienting the law from command to promise, it bears up. We bear up. We last. Because the death of Jesus manifests the life of Jesus. Jesus tells the Pharisees, I believe with tenderness in his words and love in his eyes, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, the human one, the human person that God has made, is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and he is the Lord of this table. He is the one who hosts. He is the one who invites. He is the one who feeds. So come this morning and receive your life from Jesus. Come this morning to his table and receive the promise of his rest. Let's take a few brief moments to quiet ourselves and prepare us to come to the table this morning.